I'm with AIP. I'm the Director of Federation Engagement, and we're very excited. Thank you all for joining us on this third Thursday webinar. We kicked off this series a couple months ago, and of course, today is about enterprise risk management. Frank said this before, but we've had a couple people join since then. So we are requesting that if you are able to, please right-click on yourself and update your name so it includes your member society, just so we know who everyone's with. Not everyone knows everyone else on this call. I'm still learning folks and who they are associated with. So thank you. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Loeb. He is the former AIP Chief Transformation Officer to take us through this really exciting and interactive content for the day. Matt, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. We're a leaner group than the registrations would suggest, so that will probably introduce some fluidity to what we do today. So one thing I wanted to assure you is that this will not be death by PowerPoint. In fact, quite to the contrary, I really want to make it interactive and have incorporated some breakout groups, which we will kind of decide on the fly, how many breakout groups, or in some cases, when, depending on how things are going, may choose to just keep us as a collective and work through some of the questions. We'll kind of play that by ear, but no death by PowerPoint today. And also, I want to set some expectations of outcomes. So first of all, at the end of this session, you will not be professional risk managers. And I think that's good news. We're not going to be doing any certifications. I'm not going to bore you with the laborious details of ISO 31000, which are standards for risk management practices, or the committee of sponsoring organizations of the Treadway Commission, which I'm sure would be great bedtime reading for you on all of the ins and outs of risk management. And to the contrary, what we will do is provide you with some foundation basics of enterprise risk management and give you some experience opportunities to experience it. Not by, you will not leave here with a plan for your organization, but we will have an opportunity to allow you to do the exercises in the context of your organization. And I hope that what that leads to is the ability, being a kind of a family-oriented group here, that, we can share experiences with each other, because I'm going to guess that we're all in a different place when it comes to risk management. It could be, some of us could be have very little background or exposure to it. Some of us could have a lot more. So we're going to kind of play to the middle and try to make sure we get everybody's needs. Ultimately, what we really want to do is stimulate your thinking about the construct of enterprise risk management as an organizational capability that can strengthen the stewardship of your organization, play into the doing something that we're all accountable for, which is ensuring the long-term sustainability of our organizations, and also adding to our abilities to make more informed and better knowledge-based decisions. So I'll conclude this opening salvo by saying also, we're not going to base all of this on AIP's journey, but AIP, we have done some work on this, and shortly after we get started, I'll be asking Michael Maloney to share a little bit about the AIP journey, just to contextualize it for everyone, because ERM is a journey. And then I'll remind you that enterprise risk management, while it has some while some people might think it's a science, it's really more of an art, because it is not understanding risk is it's not based all on facts. It's based also on our ability to think forward and to consider variables that could influence or impact certain situations. So there's a lot of art to this, and so I hope we'll have a little bit of fun today. So with that being said, I am going to share my screen. I promised no death by PowerPoint, but I didn't say no PowerPoint. And I think everybody can see this now. And yeah, we have a 2 hour time block. I put up to 2 hours. If we use all the available time that's there, great. And by the same token, if we move a little bit quicker, that's fine. I know that this is a challenging and exciting time of year for all of us. So what I thought we could do quickly is just to let everyone get to know each other. I would love to go around the horn and just have everyone say who they are, what society you are, and your role. And then we will come back and go right into the first breakout group. And we will divide maybe into two. Frank, I'll let you decide, 2 or 3 small breakout groups to deal with some questions. So perhaps we could start with Beth.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Beth Cunningham. I'm the CEO of the American Association of Physics Teachers. I've been in my position for 14 years. And it's been a journey.
John?
So I'm John Bagger, and I am the CEO of APS, and I've been in this role for much less than 14 years.
Michael Bronson. Brosnan, sorry, Michael.
Morning. My name is Mike Rosden. I'm the CFO with AAPT, and I've been here a little over 16 years. Thank you.
Okay. Jim Freericks?
Hi, I'm Jim Freericks. I'm a professor at Georgetown, and I'm also the treasurer of AAPT, and this is my first year in this role. I also, just a few years ago, was on the APS Council, so I'm actually familiar with both organizations, and I'm a member of both.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Judy?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Judy Dubno. I'm a professor at the Medical University of South Carolina in the Department of Otolaryngology, and currently I'm a member of the AIP Board of Directors, and I serve as the corporate secretary. And I'm also a member of the Acoustical Society of America, ASA, which is one of the member societies. And in that role, I'm on the executive council and I serve as the treasurer. And so so I've had the benefit of hearing a lot about ERM from Matt, just from being able to sit in the board meetings, but I would like to help transfer some of that information to ASA.
Great. Thank you, Judy. Francis?
I'm Francis Slicky. I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer for APS. And what that means is in my portfolio is international affairs, public engagement, government affairs, and development.
Great. Mark?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Doyle from American Physical Society. I'm the Chief Information Officer. I've been at APS for over 28 years, and I've been in my current role for about 10. So looking forward to this.
Thank you, Mark. Jane? Long time no see, Jane.
Hi, Matt. Good morning. Hello, everybody. This is Jane Gould. I'm the Chief Finance and Operating Officer for APS. So I serve in the executive office and support our meetings, our finance, and our programs, along with a fair amount of compliance and risk management.
And I'll let our AIP colleagues introduce themselves. Michael?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm having some technology issues. Mike Maloney, CEO, as you all know, of AIP.
Yep. Frank?
Hi, I'm Frank Gray, Federation Engagement Liaison at AIP.
And Frank is helping us drive today's activities, navigating our Zoom environment. So thank you, Frank, for your support. And Jessica, you already introduced yourself, but thank you also for coordinating this. And last but not least, Max.
Good morning, everybody. Max Safel. I'm the new Federation Officer here at AIP.
Very good. Okay. So now we all know who each other is, and I want to get us started in conversation. And so I've got an 8-minute breakout group scheduled here. Frank will decide who's going to what rooms. I'm going to be circulating, but the first breakout is just kind of in a smaller group, getting to know your thoughts are around what's motivated you to join today's session, sharing to what degree enterprise risk management has been implemented, if at all, on a formal basis in your society. And most importantly, how will you assess if attending this session was worthwhile investment of your time? So those are the guardrail questions for the next 8 minutes in the breakout groups. And when you come back out of the breakout groups, it'd be great to have one person from your breakout group provide a very brief 1 to 2 minute summary of things that were heard in the session. So this is just foundational, and we're going to do something with the results with the report outs when you come back. So Frank, if you could put everybody into their rooms, and we'll see everyone back here in this main room together in about eight minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for getting everyone back from their respective rooms.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we're a small enough group that we don't necessarily need to have the formality of one person reporting out, but it would be great to just get a snapshot of what came out of those discussions. So I'll kick it off though with one question, just by a show of your hands. How many of us here have a formal deployment of enterprise risk management in their organizations? And the flip side of the question is how many of us have an informal program? In other words, we think about it, we use the words, we may be doing it, not realizing it. And how many of us, I know this is hard to, but you're among friends, we don't have anything in place. Okay. So that's pretty much the continuum that we talked about, and hopefully that the discussions as we go forward today will be informative. So the second let me move let me share my screen again so that we're all grounded here. So the second question, I'm sorry. The first question was what motivated you to join this session? And the last question is how do you assess success of this being a good use of your time? What kind of things came up? I mean, just make it a little open forum. Anyone? Otherwise,
I'll start off by saying that, I think we're both of us, it was John and myself, Jane dropped out, but but she even with her, but I think we're here to learn a little bit more about risk management and how to, well, I would say on the APS side, how to coordinate their kind of smaller efforts. And with AAPT, I would say for me, how we can get the board to think more about enterprise risk management and some of the things that might be, for at least think about, that could be good and bad risks. And well, yeah, I think that, and we both pointed out, I think we all acknowledge the fact that an additional risk that many companies don't have is rest with our volunteer membership. That's a different type of risk that our volunteer members can add.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Anyone else? So I heard a couple of different things on you know, what the measures of success would be, and I'll just mention those briefly, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next part of the program. But it ranged from trying to understand this different way of thinking, using risk as a lens. I heard something, one of the interesting things that came, Slake mentioned in his, if you don't mind me mentioning this, you know, from a government affairs and policy standpoint, he's keenly interested in looking at the notion of risk as we consider the administration change that's about to take place. I see a lot of nodding heads, and my head was nodding as well when he brought that up. And then also, you know, just trying to expand the horizons of some of us who haven't been exposed to it. So I think, you know, the risk would be for me not to cover those things or not to work towards those things. Then, you know, I want you to feel that the 2 hours was worth your time or whatever time we're here together. So let's move on to the next part of the session, which is just covering the foundational aspects of what is risk management. And the first bullet here is to I want to dispel the myth that you could decide tomorrow that you want to implement a risk management program and it'll be up and running in 24 hours. For that matter, it may not be up and running in 6 months. It might take you a long time. It's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. And to that end, I wanted to give Michael Maloney an opportunity to talk about the AIP journey in ERM, because I think it will ground all of us and probably resonate with all of us, regardless of whether we have a program in place already or we kind of informally address it or don't address it at all. I'm guessing that some of the things that Michael will share will resonate with us. So Michael, let me turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Thanks, Matt, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, I think it certainly has been a journey for AIP, and a long one, with some deviations around dead ends along the way. But I think at this point we're pretty happy with where we're now at, which is really at the beginning of a new journey of implementing our new framework, which you'll hear more about this morning. And you know, I think back to when I started here, it'll be 7 years in March, and some of you were on the board back then, and you'll recall that at the back of the board book, we used to produce an Excel spreadsheet of enterprise risks, and they were managed by Gigi and her team at finance and accounting. And so but they never really changed very much. They were statements that, frankly, most board members and I myself, and I'm guessing even more so on the staff side, found hard to interpret. They didn't really help the management of the organization. And we were just going through a process to like check a box, basically, that we had an enterprise risk register, which was reviewed on an annual basis, and then we presented to the board, but it never really engendered any real conversation. And it certainly never really engendered any risk mitigation or avoidance strategies by management or the board. And so that was something which we recognized early on as we began our strategic transformation back in 2020. And we did, as mentioned here on this slide, we began to think about enterprise risk management as an organizational capability. We started off engaging with Grant Thornton. Obviously, many of you will know them, a very well-respected company. We learned some things from them about sort of what is enterprise risk and what isn't. But frankly, after a lot of dollars and a lot of time, we abandoned that work because it just didn't resonate, didn't work for us. And we found ourselves 2 years ago really back at, I don't know if it was square one, but we hadn't really evolved much beyond the same matrix of statements and mitigation statements that really didn't help us. And they were all in terms of, written in terms of failure to, secure new revenue or something. And it didn't really help us try to figure out what to do as an organization to really risk, and certainly wasn't used broadly. And so Matt and Gigi spent a lot of time going through an exercise with the board around education and such. And it started and some of you were there, with a conversation at our strategic retreat in Portland, Oregon, about enterprise risk. And we broke the board up into groups, and we got some directionality from that, but it was pretty clear that even the board wasn't quite sure how to think about enterprise risk. We ended up talking a lot about risk to the interests of the community as opposed to risks around our the organization, thinking of us as a business. And that was sort of a deviation for a while, but it was valuable because it helped us rethink how we were going to try to identify the risk, the whole matrix of risks that we may have to engage in. And Matt will go into more detail where we landed. But my measure of success was that when we presented this new framework of risk management to the board at our last strategic retreat last summer, it actually engendered a real conversation by the board. People were engaged in the framework and understanding it and how it could be valuable. And then the question was asked, well, which committee is going to own this and sort of engage with management on it? And that was my sort of metric of success, that the board actually wanted to embrace it and use it as a tool. And then similarly now, as I said earlier, when we started this process, it was sort of managed by Gigi in finance and accounting and was a sort of a check the box exercise. But it now is regularly part of our executive team conversation. And then also at the manager level on our managers team. So at AIP, for those of you who don't know, we have basically now a fairly flat structure that has executive team that cover the 8 strategic tracks for the organization. And then a manager's team, which includes everybody who manages people in the organization. And that's about 20 people out of the 115 or so. And so we now engage in conversations with them at the executive team on a sort of quarterly basis, reviewing where we are on managing the risk in our identified areas. So again, I'm not sure any of that's going to make sense until you see some of what Matt's going to present, but it has taken us over 2 years of work to get to a point that we feel we have a point of departure for actually engaging in real risk management. And so I finally understand it. I didn't before. I understand how the main risks are identified. I understand how we engage managers from across the organization to identify them and identify some mitigation strategies or avoidance strategies. And I now feel that the leadership, the strategic leadership of the organization and the executive team have a better point of view of where the risks are in the organization. So happy to take any questions, but I hope that sort of gives you some high level understanding of where we've been. And some of you have been watching us through this journey over the last couple of years.
So before I move on, any questions for clarification or anything you want to ask Michael before we move on?
Yeah, Michael, why did the first effort fail? In other words, how is a nonprofit's risk management different than a company's, for example?
So on the second issue, I'm not sure that it is.
Mhm.
Um, we may have different dimensions of risk, but I think the overall framework is pretty much the same whether you're a for-profit corporation or a not-for-profit corporation. There are different communities that introduce different risks. That was part of your conversation earlier. You know, at a society, absolutely volunteers in a society introduce a certain level of risk in certain dimensions. But you know, if you're a supermarket chain, your customers do. So we don't have the customer in with the trolley, you know, the cart going around the supermarket, but we have other risks. So I think that was part of one of the things we sort of struggled with was trying to figure that out and embrace it, that we're just like any other corporation. We have to manage the enterprise, the risks, and the board has a duty to manage the risk and understand the risks and hold management accountable. And nonprofit boards are not necessarily used to doing that in the same way that for-profit boards are doing, but the fiduciary responsibility is essentially the same.
Mhm.
So I don't know that there is a difference. And to answer your first question about why the first one didn't work, it was so opaque. It wasn't inclusive in how we came about identifying the risks. The language used, frankly, did not um, allow anybody other than somebody who was sort of deep in the analysis to understand what the risk was. It was written in a very sort of formal risk management language that, you know, might have made sense to somebody who has the appropriate certifications in risk management, but to your regular board member or your senior staff person in the organization, read like gobbledygook. I mean, it just didn't make sense. And so it was just, you know, you sort of scratching your head going, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And I think that was why it really failed. And I hope what we've done now is we've come up with statements and mitigation statements in response to the statements of risk that help provide much more clarity and transparency about what the risk is and how to manage it. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe I can use that too as a launching pad for some key points here. I mean, number one is I want to I want to pile on Michael's comment, John, that we are all corporations. So, you know, the general framework for the general principles and foundational aspects of risk management are applicable no matter what kind of corporation you are, even though when you get down to the specific risks, we might have a different set of risks being a nonprofit membership association than JP Morgan would have, you know, that's managing finances. It's just that's a slightly different kettle of fish. And I think the lesson from that uh, is that when we think about setting off to put in place a risk program for our organizations, while we can follow some of the general practices, ultimately it has to be curated for the organization itself. So, and I think, you know, just in the group that we have assembled here, the way in which a program might be enabled at APS is going to be very different than the way Beth and AAPT do it, just because of, you know, could be something as simple as the magnitude of the size of the organization. But that doesn't mean that the practices, the foundational practices aren't similar. So that's something to keep in mind as we even go through what we're talking about here is that, you know, I might show you a sample of a template or a report, or I'll be talking. Ultimately, there is no foolproof set of forms that you would use. Again, everything really needs to be put into the context of your organization and what is right for that. the second thing that I would hit on now, even though I was going to hit on it later, because Michael, John, your question and about why did the first pass not work, and Michael's answer to that is in that curating it for our organization, we need to determine at what level we need to have our risk program operating, because oftentimes risk programs fail because they become overly complex, they become too difficult to manage. And, even in larger organizations where you have people who are trained and certified in risk, the tendency to infuse too much risk speak dilutes the ability of the broader organization to truly understand the challenge and to look through a risk lens when they're doing their work. And that sets up the note, John, I mentioned it to you in the breakout group, but for everyone's benefit, when we think about a risk, what is it? So it's an event that, if it happened, could have a material impact on our organization. And inherently, our mindset and the way we've all grown up with the word risk is that we think that's going to be a negative, that it's something that could bring down our organization or impede our ability to accomplish our mission or whatever. What we oftentimes overlook is that risk could also be driven by a favorable situation, a favorable shift in the marketplace, or our organization being presented with an opportunity where the consideration is, my goodness, we could really accelerate our ability to accomplish our mission if we invest in this opportunity. Let's put DEI on it, right? That we could really advance changing the way in which the profession becomes welcoming. The risk is, what do we have to stop doing or not do in order to accomplish that, right? But it's for good. An identified risk could also be something that would be for good. So we need to make sure that in risk programs, and when we think about identifying organizational risks, that we're not just looking at the downside, that there's also upside that could be realized. And a lot of that consideration I'll come back to that in a little bit. Another component of the risk, of what ERM is also assessing the likelihood that an event will happen. So as sure as I'm sitting here, and I know that if Gigi were here, she would be singing this from this hymnal from the AIP standpoint, right? I'm sure for any of our organizations, we could develop a list of 150 risks, that there are 150 scenarios and events that we could come up with. So the first thing is, that's not, if you're dealing with that many risks, the complexity is going to be overwhelming, and you're not going to have an effective program because you're not going to have time to dedicate to all of that. So you're going to have to filter those down. And one of the things to keep in mind too is kind of the timeline window. What are the things like right now, Slate brought up the notion of the change of administration. Well, that's going to be here and now, right? So that might be a good risk lens to look through and say, what are the things that could happen, and assessing the likelihood that they would happen. Because when we assess the likelihood of their happening, the ones that are of the most significant magnitude, and we're going to talk more about this later as well, the ones that are most significant magnitude are the ones that we're going to want to pay most attention to. And again, we'll come back to that in a little bit.
Hey,
And
Matt,
then,
I have a question for you, if I
Sure.
can. You mentioned earlier 150 is an overwhelming list for any organization. I get that. For organizations of our size, what's a manageable number of risks to meaningfully think about and address?
So again, it would ultimately come down to answering the question just in principle. I would say that if you have a list of maybe 20, that would be manageable. thinking APS, but I'm saying that rather arbitrarily without, if we go through the process, it's a good process to come up with the 150 and then to whittle it down to what are the ones that really pose the most material risk. But I would say, if you have any more than 20, 25, you're not going to be able to pay attention to those on an ongoing basis, and it's going to become too cumbersome. Even if, one of the recommendations I would have is whether you have somebody who does this by job or whether you have somebody who is doing another job who serves as your point of contact. You need somebody who is accountable for the risk program. It has to be manageable within the scope of which you give that individual, and in order for them to make sure that they're facilitating the program across the organization and with the governance side, to make it as effective as possible. Does that give you what you need? It's like, think. And then another component is what happens if the events happen, anticipating the impact. And I'm stopping short of financial because financial is a component, right? We want to understand that, but also what if an event happens, what's the disruption to the organization? And again, disruption can be good or bad depending on the scenario. But doing that diligence, John, you were talking earlier about, the what ifs, right? Taking yourself through what if, this is something from my own past where, what if a local chapter leader or a local chapter group decides to buy real estate in Mexico using the organization's name? What are you going to do? Right. So, that is a true story, but that's a sidebar for another time. But going through and trying to understand the impact of those events is another important component.
Can I add one thing, Matt, that
Sure.
I think is important and reasons why our prior approach didn't work, I think. I think it was about really understanding broadly about the potential for impact on the risk statements. And I think in our former program, we didn't really engage in a conversation with folks across the organization at the manager level, for instance, around trying to understand the risk and the impact of the risk. And certain of the risk statements were there because it sort of made, if I could say, made the board feel good it was there. Like there was one around failure to appropriately manage our archives was one of them. Strategically important for the board, but was it really appropriate for the risk register at the highest level? And then what was the impact of the organization going to be? We didn't really go through any, conversation around that topic, for instance, 5 or 6 years ago. Yet it was on the risk register. But was it really helping us in any sort of way? It was a strategic issue and was being pursued under our strategy, but wasn't really, I think, appropriately on the risk register necessarily because it's a different kind of analysis that gets you to put it on the risk register. So I think our broad engagement with the staff and the process we went through at the manager level helped us sort through some of that. I don't know if that resonates, Matt, with you or not, but it's sort of trying
Yeah,
to figure out why it didn't work before.
yeah, that's a good segue to what I've moved here on the slide, right? And this is just the guide. I mean, for the board has a fiduciary responsibility for oversight of risk of the whole ERM program. ERM is a top priority for executive leadership. I mean, we need to be looking through this lens every day, because at the end of the day, especially if you're a CEO, the accountability for the operation and its long-term sustainability rests on your shoulders, right? I mean, the board is going to decide whether you're, delivering on that or not. But the point that Michael went to is probably the most salient point. I mean, so first of all, it would be easy to generate a list of 150. And I said to Slake's question, I said, well, maybe it's good to do that. One of the most valuable things is engaging the broader staff organization in this discussion. The most logical reason to do that is that generally those of us that are sitting at executive level or board level, we are not in the operational day to day of every little detail that happens. The staff who are closest to it offer the best insight. And they also offer the opportunity. So for them, there's going to be a learning component where they can learn about risk, but most importantly, they'll also help engage in that discussion that when a risk is identified, they'll engage in that discussion that helps us determine, is this something that should be on the risk register? And I'll talk about risk register in a minute. This is just the most important thing because it also leads to the fact that um, the notion of a risk has to be incorporated into your organizational culture. I stop short of saying you need to have a risk culture because every time we turn around, there's another culture that needs to be added. But the construct of risk and looking at it from, also prioritization, right? That's a risk, a decision to do something and not do something else. That's a response to a organizational risk because resources are finite. So it's really important to engage the staff in this. It's really important to incorporate into all of your business processes that run the organization on a day-to-day basis the construct of risk. And this really cites you need to keep it simple and understandable. At the same time, it takes time to do this because if you're trying to impact your culture, it doesn't happen overnight. And it has to be top to bottom throughout the organization, and everyone needs to understand their roles. And I didn't incorporate this into the presentation, but when Gigi and I were working on the current framework for AIP, we went into that level and say, who's accountable, who's responsible, what we call the form RACI, but who's accountable, who's responsible, who contributes to the decision, and who needs to be kept informed. And going through that kind of discipline when you're doing this is exceedingly important. Uh, any questions so far? So I just want to touch on risk register because there's been a couple of references to it. Risk register is where you capture risks. And elements of a risk register include the risk itself, the risk could be succession planning. But then you want a statement that encapsulates what that risk is. And this is a very hard part too. We could talk about failure to do something, or we could talk about the inability to act. You need to think carefully about what conveys in as succinct way as possible, what conveys what that risk is. And the statement has to include the statement of the risk and the impact, and basically the impact on the organization. You want this, it's a two-part statement. So on this little sample here, I mentioned succession planning, right? Failure to quickly fill open positions and to capture knowledge from outgoing staff. That I would say that in our effort to continue to refine it is that the the real risk to the organization is that knowledge is lost and we would have a lack of continuity of programs, or we would not be able to keep our programs on schedule. So you need to be thinking about that risk statement being very precise. In terms of categories, what's important about categorization, we would determine that based on what what's important to the organization. But generally, the kinds of things that come up is the risk related to the culture of the organization? Is the risk related to the market positioning of the organization? Is it geopolitical in nature? So basically, you come up with some categories so that you can look more holistically at risks that are in the same category, because oftentimes you'll find that risk statements will overlap and that will present opportunities to consolidate it into something that's more succinct and more actionable. A very important other thing is generally with risk, we tend to look internally first, particularly in associations of our ilk, because the very fact that we have members and volunteers is it brings risk to the forefront every day. And I'll just let it go at that. But we also need to recognize, and this, again, this is where I think Slake's comment about the change of administration. There are things happening around our organizations that also create risks for the organization. So it's extremely important to be, yes, you want to look internally and operationally. We also need to look externally at what's happening outside our organizations that could lead to an impact within. I mean, one of the lowest hanging fruit issues in this was, the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, right? That was an external geopolitical event, but it's had ramifications to all of us. And then the other elements are things I referenced earlier: likelihood that the event will happen, what the impact is on the organization, and what the financial impact is. So again, this gets curated to the needs of the organization. So we're not going to have one of these today, but it is something for you to think about, that if you want to implement this program formally, or you want to move your informal to bring more discipline to it, establishing a formal risk register is a good next step. And the purpose of this slide was just to really reinforce why ERM is valuable. Certainly there's a governance component to it because of what we mentioned as the role of the board and its fiduciary role to have oversight of risk. I'm a member of NACD and very active. In fact, I have a certification as a board director, which for some of our could be an interesting program to be thinking about for some of our board members to further their education, because many of our board members in nonprofits haven't gone through some formal training. The reason I brought up NACD is that this notion of risk, I mean, it is up there at the top of the list. Other than hiring the CEO, having oversight of the risk for the organization is a key role for the board. So this is actually a very important topic. Increasing awareness through the organization. This is a formal way to do that because you can build your story around it, which enables you to communicate it effectively to boards, volunteer committees, internal staff. So creating that risk awareness, and that's part of the cultural embedding of it. Enabling effective decision-making. Essentially what goes through the process of assessing risk and its impact and your response to those risks is a form of informing decision-making in the organization. I mentioned prioritization. Managing risk leads to helping you determine where the organizational priorities are as well. And then some of the downstream benefits of it is you can improve your financial performance and better ensure organizational sustainability. And then there's even this construct where if we do this well, it could provide competitive advantage. Now, you all can decide who your competitors are versus your collaborators, but I think the understanding of if we can be more precise about where we're prioritizing work and where we're mitigating and or eliminating risk that might detract from our ability to focus on the strategic things that matter, it could create a form of competitive advantage for us. So with that being said, we're getting to what I would say is that we're getting to the next breakout session, and I'm wondering this time whether it makes sense to go to breakout groups or if we just kind of manage this discussion as a quote committee of the whole. Um, the intent was, and we'll brainstorm this together, the intent of this breakout group was not to have you come up with your own risk register, but was to have everyone reflect on their organization and identify a couple of risks that you think are top of mind and important to the organization, just to have something to work with in the breakout discussion. And then to have the opportunity to share with one another how you might populate the risk register on that. Like, so, what would the impact be? What's going through your head about the financial implications? And then essentially having the opportunity to perform the experience, perform the operation of going through and dissecting the risk and populating that, and then see how your thinking compares with those in the group. So here's we could do this as a group of the whole, or we could split into small groups and let you have some dialogue for maybe 10 minutes and then come back and have a group discussion. What do you think? How many people, show of hands, would rather have smaller breakout groups for this? Or how many would like to have just stay as a single group here and talk about it? So we had 1-to-1, 2-to-1. How about we try to do this? How about we try to do this with a committee of the whole? And here's how I would suggest it. Why don't you take 2 minutes and let's see what you can maybe have a piece of paper with you. Write down, say, 2 risks that you see in your organization, and maybe just start some of those components that you would put on the risk register. I will actually um, put the risk register. Now I got to see what I did here with the. So I'm going to leave the elements of the risk register here. Why don't you take, let's say, 2 to 3 minutes, write down a couple of risks, and think about the elements, and then we'll see who wants to volunteer to share something from their organization. Now, I put top risks here. It can be anything that's top of mind. It's strictly for the example, and I hope it'll be something that you would be willing to share with the group so that we can learn from each other's experience. So let's start the 2 minutes now, and I'll check in with you at 11:07.
Matt, I just see a blank screen from you.
I'm sorry?
I don't see a screen share from you right now. I see a
Oh,
blank screen.
So John,
how
at
do you
the
see
very
it?
top? Yeah, it's there. I think there are
Uh,
2
It,
tabs at the top.
it just came through. That's good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I had to click a button that I was not familiar with. So, okay. So everybody good to jot down a few notes, and then we'll come back and have a discussion around it. Need another minute? All right, are we good to go, or you need some more time? Whatever works. Thumbs up? Okay. So who would be a daring soul to volunteer a risk that you identified in your organization, and we'll talk about some of the risk register elements and then give someone else a turn. Anyone would like to throw something out there?
I will, Matt. I'm not sure how much of the table I can fill in, but I think I had selected two, but I'll start with the second, which is the political and legal landscape on diversity. And you had focused on the legal, and I think that's true. That's probably true that there is a risk of legal action, but, and I don't know if this is an appropriate way to think about risk, but I also feel there's a risk for the society meeting its goals and mission. Because if we have, we're now, I feel, in this defensive posture of maybe retreating from some of our goals. And I think that would be a risk because we may not achieve what the society really wants to achieve by not standing by the programs that we've developed. So I don't know. So that is illegal, it has a legal sense to it, but I'm not sure if I've, uh, if I've, described it in a way that is a risk, in your sense.
Actually, Judy, it's a brilliant example. And what you did is you put it in an ASA context.
Mhm.
And it's not that the notion of a legal risk doesn't exist. I mean, I think the risk statement you were just inferring is that the current posture, the current landscape of DEI is impeding the society's, has the risk of impeding the society's ability to deliver on its strategic goals.
Mhm. Yes.
That is a very reasonable risk statement.
You said it much better than I could, but yes, that's exactly right.
But I said it only because you fed me the words. But I mean that, right? We just did that in a minute. But that's what you have to do for all of these. And so the thing is, Judy, I'm gonna work with you on work with me on this one, right? So what is your sense of the likelihood of the likelihood that the society will not achieve its objectives?
It really depends on what happens in the next 3, 6, 9 months. And I'm learning a lot from what we've learned. Again, by being on the board, I've learned a lot of information, and actually ASA has benefited from having the consultant, AIP consultant, speak to some of the people in one of our committees. But it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the next, I don't know, 9 months to a year. And maybe there's an intermediate ground is what I'm hoping will happen. That it isn't that we shut down the programs, but that we modify them in a way that lowers the risk, so we could still achieve our goals and lower the risk of legal action.
So you are going through in what you just said, and Beth, I see your hand up, so just bear with me. What you said about it depends. the change in the risk analysis would be to consider the it depends. Like, so, we think that, so if you look at this sample risk registers, this is a piece of the AIP template, which again doesn't mean that it would be ASA's template. But we had a rating system that said if we gave it a 3, we thought it would be very likely to happen. If we gave it a 1, it would be very unlikely to happen. And 2 was obviously in the middle. You kind of have to take it depends, and even though you could run through those scenarios, it's important to take a posture on it, because that decision that you make, or it's not the judgment that you make, then informs how the organization can choose to respond to that risk, which is a concept that's going to come up shortly. So I'm just taking you through the mechanics of this because your thinking is you are thinking through the risk. The challenge is if this is going to help you, it's to be able to say, well, yeah, it depends, but at this point, we think it's very likely that this is going to impact our ability to deliver on our strategic objectives, which then says we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to stick with our strategic objectives, or are we going to modify our programs? Are we going to, abandon the programs? So I'm just taking you through the thought process that goes with all of this.
Yeah.
And
Okay, that was very helpful.
before I go to Beth, just on this topic, just to finish this out, is there a financial implication in your mind?
I don't think so. No, I don't. I maybe, I guess, I mean, that, I guess you could think of it in the very long term that it would be less likely that people would want to join the society because they don't offer the programs that people like to see in a society. They're so I mean, I guess that's a long, but as far as an immediate financial risk, no, but in the long term, I could see students not being wanting to be part of the society, and other people who typically join. So in that way, perhaps, yes.
So in general, the same principle would apply here, which is you would go through a process of the thought process that you were just going through. And then on this one, I would have seen you landing at maybe minimal at this juncture. And, but the point is to arrive at a conclusion, at a judgment that, because again, you're then building in more discipline to determine the response to the risk, which again, we'll cover later. So thank you, Judy, for being volunteer.
One other thing, maybe I'm interpreting it by membership, but it is a reputational risk.
Sure.
Which then leads to lower membership and participation, so on.
And that speaks to the risk statement, which could be modified to say we want to achieve our strategic objectives, and the reputation of ASA will decline, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just taking you through.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a willing volunteer. So thanks for being patient. Beth?
Yeah, I was gonna add to what Judy was saying, that the risk is there's a reputational / membership risk with backing off or backing down or some change in your DEI or strategic plan. But it could be even, I don't know, Judy, I would say for AAPT, and this would be, I had this on as one of I've listed like a half a dozen or more risks for AAPT, but I would say for this, it's a higher risk than, I see this having more of an immediate impact on the loss of membership because of, not taking a leadership role and with DEI.
So this is a great time to say everybody's right, but I mean, in the end, right, your organization, Beth, might might look differently even through the same lens. You might look differently and make different decisions. So this just illustrates further why everything has to be curated to your organization. So I'd like to suggest if we want to do one more, we could do that. But I also realize that I have not been a very good host at being inclusive because Dwayne joined us and I never let you introduce yourself to the group. And I apologize for that. So just a quick hello to everyone. Could you say, well, we know what your name is, but and where you work, but what do you do?
Yeah, so hello, and I probably calls that you were not being rude. I was coming from another meeting. Dwayne Norris, I'm with AAAS as the Chief People Officer. Fairly new there. As I was telling folks in the breakout group, this is only my second time coming to these meetings, and I really appreciate the opportunity. My CEO just kind of was on your mailing list and forwarded to me, and the last two topics have been very relevant. Um, um, I approached the people side of the organization through a very different lens. I spent 28 years um, um, as a kind of an applied research consulting role at the American Institute for Research, AIR, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And there I was part of, the three-legged stool with my CFO and the CEO running that business. Over those 3 decades, we went from I remember early in my career when we celebrated 25 million revenue year. And I remember when we got close to the billion mark. I am an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist. I've done ERM work both in a consulting capacity and as from the C-suite. And I think it's good to see more attention being given to that. I view these as you have tools that you operate organizations with. You have your strategy in one hand and your risk management plan in the other hand. The only other thing I was going to add just to the earlier discussion is that getting at the right level in this sort of conversation you got is the hard thing. And I really like your last bullet there that says it's unique and curated to the organization's needs. That's really important. So thanks. It's nice to meet you all. I plan to continue, and I probably talked too long. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for joining us, and appreciate your insights, and welcome to the community. You've had a very interesting journey. So to get back to our risk, do we want to go through one more? Someone want to share one? Because I think now that Judy volunteered and we took her through the process, maybe the next one we would move through a little more quickly. Anyone want to share one? Now, don't make me call on you. Great, John, thank you.
So again, I'm not very practiced in putting this in the right form, but I think the question is, what if the early career scientists, Generation Z, see no need for member organizations since they can do their connection in other ways? So I think that's a huge risk for our organization.
So, John, is that an internal risk or an external risk?
Well, that's external in that it depends on what Generation Z sees about us, but the response, of course, is internal. We have to make ourselves attractive to them.
Yeah. I asked the question because I would agree with your assertion that it's an external risk, right? It's one of those generational things that would not just create impact on APS, it would um, it would have broader impact on the association industry, right? As a whole. So external risks are good. And would, so if I was asking you to um, talk about the likelihood of that happening, and we'll use the scale 1 to 3. 3, it's going to be better than better than 70% likelihood of happening versus a 1 where it's very small chance of happening. How would you
Yes,
rate?
right. So what is the it again? What did I say is happening?
Well, you're saying that Generation Z says that we don't need associations anymore.
Yeah. So, all right, I'll say it's a 2 because I think some of them will still find value and some
Okay,
won't.
great. I'm just taking you through the process.
Yeah,
And
and I would say the impact is 3 because
financial impact is 3.
it costs us our members, and our members are our lifeblood.
Okay. Okay. So it'll be interesting when we get to the next part of the exercise. Hold on to that one, and maybe we'll use that one as a collaborative group discussion when we talk about risk response.
Well, actually, if we just turned ourselves into a publisher and got rid of all of our members, maybe some of our risks would go down, and our expenses would certainly go down. So
So
with our present mission, it would have the catastrophic impact. Yes.
if we had more time, I would take that with you and with the group, and I would do a deeper dive because while someone might think that that last comment you had was flippant, I believe that there are scenarios in that. There are risk scenarios to evaluate in that, which is, I mean, the one question is membership? If membership revenue were to go away, what would we do as an organization to survive, or to sustain our operation? Or how might the organization change? So those kinds of dialogues emerge from the identification of the risk, and that creates a good playing field for exercising those possibilities. Because you might get some, again, it may have started out with a flippant comment, but there may be more merit to what you're saying longer term than, than people realize.
Well, I will say that we are looking at our membership models. It's not so much the revenue from membership that's important, but the fact that we have these members is what gives us the clout we have in Washington because we can say we speak for these people, in my opinion, but we'll see.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna push us a little bit forward because we're within about 34 minutes of being done. So I'm going to go quickly on this. I'm not going to take you through this eye chart or smaller type. The message here, though, is that when you implement an ERM program, it's a cycle. It follows a cycle. So there's analysis involved, there's monitoring involved, there's planning involved, and ultimately, we have to come to grips with what the magnitude of the risks that we're looking at and how the organization is going to respond to them. So just as you'll have access to these slides. This is an example of the program cycle at AIP. This came out of the work that Michael referenced earlier that Gigi and I worked on and shared with the board. So John and Judy, you've seen this, but this is the annual cycle. And the thing I would emphasize in the new AIP ERM framework is that one of the biggest benefits is that while we have the cycle down, we also have simplified it so that now Gigi and her team, really it's Gigi and one member of her team, um, know the work that needs to be done and that it's manageable and that it's useful and it is aligned to what the board has looked at and is expecting. And so that the cadence at which the board is going to look at this is defined. And so these are all important things that when you build the program, that you build this annual cycle so that it's manageable, easy to understand, but that you also ensure, it's back to that point I said, you need to have somebody whose accountability is to manage this program. Even though it will touch the whole organization, you need someone who's accountable for making sure it happens. So I mentioned this notion of magnitude. The magnitude, the big thing now in risk management is to rate the risks and to decide which risks actually rise to the top of the ones that need the most attention, the one that needs the most precise care and feeding, response plan, monitoring, etc. So I'm sharing this. This is an offshoot. This is actually the algorithm that we're using at AIP, but this doesn't have to be your algorithm. I mean, again, this is where we would curate it. But as a general practice in risk, we develop a risk rating by taking a quantitative measure of the likelihood, multiplying it by the magnitude of by our assessment of the magnitude of the impact, and then add to that the financial impact to come up with a score. So a score, so I showed the legend here that again, we're using at AIP. A couple of things I want to say about this. While that's a simple math problem, we're dealing with something that is filled with variables. So what I might identify today as a red risk in the 10 to 12 range, when we evaluate it next year, it might come down. It might decrease in risk because of market conditions changing, organizational priorities changing. If something that is green right now, which means more than likely we're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about it, even though we're keeping our eye on it, it could escalate because something happens and that it causes it. So there's the math is not what I mean. The math is calculated according to what the math comes out with, but it's not going to be stable year after year after year, right? It's going to change. So this is just a tool for the organization to use to rate the risks and to see which things are of the highest concern. And generally, it's the things that are of the highest concern that if I put my board hat on, those are the ones I want to hear about. Those are the ones that I want to know are being actively mitigated, and I want to keep my finger more on the pulse of making having the assurance that the organization is responding to that risk in an appropriate manner. So. Um, so again, if I was going to have you go back and do risk ratings as an example with the risks that you said to see where they ended up, but I don't think we need to go through that mechanics. I would simply ask, are there any questions to this construct? Because I'm going to move from here to the notion of risk response, where I think we could spend a little bit more time talking about that. Any questions on this? Okay, hearing none. So for risk responses, generally, if like when we were going through the exercise, we tend to move immediately to, well, what would our organizational response be? But what I've put out here is a higher order before you get to defining the specifics that the organization will do, which is these are high-level categories in which you can handle risk. So the one that is most common to everyone is the orange one in the middle, mitigation, which is all about reducing the impact and probability of an event to a level that the organization is comfortable with. So mitigation tends to be where our heads go immediately, like, oh, well, we need to do this so that we minimize the financial burden that if it happens, or that we would take those actions. When you mitigate, though, you're reducing impact of the risk. You're not eliminating risk. In fact, eliminating risk is very difficult to do and requires a different set of actions. So mitigation tends to be the de facto way in which we look at it. However, it's important to look at it in another way. And it's on the next slide. I mentioned risk appetite and risk, and I infer about risk tolerance. I'm going to say something about these words. At the end, if we're sitting in a board meeting, or if we're senior leader in our organization, we need to have some alignment between what the organization's appetite is for risk. In other words, there may be some things in which we invest in that might have only a 50% chance of happening. That, like, if we invest in this program, there's a 50% chance that we're going to create a great societal impact. And if we choose as an organization to make that investment, I would argue that with those just on its face, we have a pretty big risk appetite, that we're willing to take that leap and make that investment, knowing that there's a 50-50 chance it'll work. As opposed to if I am faced with a proposal where it's 90%, or it's 50-50, but I'm conservative, I might not want to invest in that, in which case I would have a lower risk appetite. And similarly, risk tolerance is this concept of what is the organization willing to bear if something bad happens, right? So if we had a GDPR violation, right? Are we willing to tolerate the fine from the EU that would, for a single violation, could max out at $1.8 million? Are we willing to tolerate that risk? So I'm not going to go any deeper on that today, unless you want to ask questions about it. But I want to come back to the strategies for risk response planning. So mitigation is one we defer to generally, because it's how in passive learning we've kind of learned about mitigating risks. But there are some other approaches. One is outright risk avoidance. If we say, look, we don't want anything to do with this risk, we don't want it to hit our radar, we are going to, at all costs, we're going to make whatever investments are necessary to ensure that we eradicate that risk. That is a strategy that an organization can take. Sometimes doing that can have ill effects on, can require a significant investment financially, or sometimes it could be the institute of very rigid policy that could have an adverse impact on morale. But in the end, it's a decision it's an option that exists to say, we just want to avoid this risk at all costs. Another approach is transferring the risk. So I mentioned GDPR and things related to security and privacy. It's become almost a de facto approach that if we are implementing a platform, a software platform that creates risk around GDPR and cybersecurity, we are doing our best to transfer that risk to reduce our exposure by transferring the responsibility for some of that risk onto the providers of the software. Now, that doesn't mean when we transfer the risk that we don't still maintain risk, because at the end of the day, if we're publishing something, I'm sorry, if we're using member records in an inappropriate way, and there are member records and it traced back to us, if the inappropriate action is happening because of a problem in the platform, yeah, we might have cause to go back to the people who provide the platform, but at the end of the day, the organization is still going to have some responsibility. But the notion of transferring risk is a strategy to move the risk closer to where that risk could present itself and to minimize the risk exposure to the organization itself. So that's a different strategy. And then finally is acceptance. So acceptance is simply we've looked at the risk, we've looked at the likelihood, we've looked at the impact, the operational impact, and we've looked at the financial impact. And you know what? We're just willing to live with it. That's risk acceptance. So, John, coming back to the generational question and its impact, and what would be your reaction? Which of these planning options, we're doing this for fun. Which of these risk response planning options do you think you would move towards in given what you said about the likelihood of the early career professional not valuing engagement in society and that having an impact on the financial side of the equation, which one of these would you gravitate towards?
Well, given that I'm asserting that members are core to our mission, I'll work by the process of elimination. We can't avoid it because we can't change their behavior. We can't transfer it because we can't buy insurance. We certainly can't accept it because it's too serious. And so therefore we have to mitigate it, which is why we're trying to revise our products and services.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you for going through the thought process behind that, because you were evaluating all of them. And I would tell you that in some instances of risks, you might find situations where you employ more than one strategy, more than one risk response planning. But going through the thought process that John just shared with us makes a lot of sense. So
I would have thought a good risk register in that piece of the spreadsheet would only have one choice.
Well, you can do whatever you want with the spreadsheet, John. I remember to be curated to the organization. Generally, and in fact, I was going to show this in some of the reporting. Generally, you opt for one. But like, for instance, when I say on the security and privacy ones where we transfer that risk, we still are left with some risk. And when we've taken the approach to transfer, but then we know that there may be some residual parts of the risk. And for that, we might say, well, we accept that.
Got it. Yeah.
Another way of putting it, John, is you might want to mitigate that risk for the young members, but maybe they still don't join you because you didn't figure out the right way to get them. You're ultimately going to have to then accept it.
And therein, this is how you fuel the dialogue. And again, this is at the very outset, I said, well, this is not a science, right? I mean, you use good discipline around it, but in the end, there's a lot of predictive aspects to this work. So, any other thoughts on risk response planning options? All right, I will move on then. So this was going to be the breakout, but I'm going to say that with our small group that's left here, we don't need to do that. We kind of just went through some of that thinking. And what I wanted to just share next is, ultimately the output of your risk programs has to result in some reporting. So I just have a couple of samples here, not because this is how it would look for your organization, but it's to stimulate your thinking about, well, what might we want this to look like? And by the way, if anyone's interested in some more models like this, you can let me know. And there are different ways to present it. You need to be thinking about what is it that you want to communicate and how do you want that story to take hold, because there are some very sophisticated looking models. Oftentimes I find those very difficult to follow, but there are different ways of visually representing the current state of your risk program. So these samples are from our AIP work, and the notion of the dashboard was to create a very simple visual of all of the identified risks that we are monitoring on our risk register, along with their risk ratings, to give a visual picture of our assessment of those risks. And so that is all that's being portrayed here. Obviously, put your director hat on, or your executive leadership hat on, right? You're going to dial into the red ones. You're going to be like, okay, I want to go a little bit deeper than that on it. And so to that end too, we need to be thinking about how much more color do we want to provide in our reporting. And so this is a sample board report. And this is extracted from what we provided to the AIP board in June, I believe. Yeah, in June. And so this says, for instance, political, legal, and regulatory landscape, super high risk based on the risk rating. It makes the statement of the makes it presents the risk statement, and then it says what the response plan is. So it says we're going to use mitigation as the planning strategy, and then these are the three things that we're doing to mitigate the risk. And again, if you were chose, let's just say you have you're doing a new technology implementation, and technology, that the risk around the technology implementation is red, because you have security and privacy concerns, then you might have on here, well, we're transferring that risk because we're moving to a system where we're using external providers, and we're using that. We have cybersecurity insurance, and we're doing that. So that's more of a transfer mode. Again, you can indicate that here, but this is again just to stimulate your thinking. Any questions on these last two slides? Any reactions?
I mean, I have I don't know if it's more a comment than a question. I think one of the biggest concerns I have with this process is the lack of having a great way of providing ratings that are truly accurate. And then the coarseness of your rating scale that could make bigger differences between things that might be smaller differences. I would much prefer some kind of a rating scale that was more on a continuum with like bands than something that was producing a single number. There's a simplicity in the number, but I just wonder what your comments are on that. We are not experts at properly assessing what the true risk is of many of these risks that we're identifying, and how do you cope with that?
So I love your comment, because I would say that what I've shared with you is at the simplest approach. But what's happening now in the risk community is that there are some very sophisticated models that are being put in play, particularly in the financial services. And I think there'll be things for us to learn from that, where, even there are some AI constructs being implemented in these models to try to gain greater precision on the risk. I'm still a bit skeptical on the AI-based models for things that are non-financial, but I'm kind of watching those. But to your point, it's the question of what level of so if you want to create a more robust means to measure your risk, to do your risk ratings, it's a question of what level of investment you would be willing to make to develop that measurement system. And and when I say investment, it may be financial, it may be non-financial, it may just be time and the effort that's behind it. But the thing is, to what end is what I would always ask. Because in the end, because if you're in financial services, you actually want things that are more predictive, um, that are going to give you a greater sense of what really might happen. So predictive analytics in the financial services or the insurance industry makes perfect sense that they have far more robust models, and that's why they have risk departments. Um, so, so my summary answer to you is it's a question of what does the organization need to have the right conversation and to make the right decisions. And that's something that when you commit to building the program, that's something that you would decide. And so I'll leave it at that because we've got two hands raised. So Slake and then Michael.
Yeah, I think it's a quick question, Matt. So on your formula that gets you to say number to 12 in your diversified products, right? So the formula is likelihood times impact plus financial impact. So when it's exclusively financial impact in your formula, are you just using financial impact twice in the same formula?
Where in the formula that we've used here is that the impact without finance is operational impact.
Okay.
And then the financial impact is another layer of impact. Because there's an impact that it has on the organization reputation, and then there's a financial matter. So, like I said, it's a very simple model. And basically, the way we're using the model is that if there's a financial impact, it's getting 3 points in our current model. I don't want to suggest too that it's over the long term, it's going to stay like that. That's just where we ended up at this juncture. And I think part of the when when you move into this new framework, we're also going to be evaluating. I don't think I'm putting words in Gigi's mouth. We'll be evaluating how it's working, and there are opportunities to refine it going forward.
Yeah,
Michael?
I think that's right, Matt. I mean, this is the first go around, and Jim, I totally hear you. I'm a big skeptic of scoring systems, period. I remember time at the academies, every time a committee would say, well, let's just have a scoring system to do our prioritization. I was going, eh. So, but I will say that it has its role in the process, in the overall process. And one of the valuable outcomes from having to go through the scoring process was the conversation around impact and financial impact and operational impact. Um, and the opportunity that then gave us to engage with our internal subject matter experts to engage them in a conversation to better understand impact both at the executive and manager level. And so that whole conversation was valuable. And it also allowed us to at least message, albeit at a very rough, in a very rough, unscientific way, at least message to the board. These are the ones that are, floating to the top among the 20 risks or whatever it is. These are the ones that are the ones where we see right now as being the ones where we need to pay some more urgent attention to. And it also allows us to hopefully get some insights into trends over time as well as to whether we've been actually able to mitigate or avoid risk or transfer risk in particular and have the board then hold us accountable. So it is by no means a perfect system at all, and we would never say that, but it has had some value, both to give a certain line of sight and visibility, both to the board and internally with staff, as to sort of the diversity of elements of risk across the organization. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Dwayne, did you want to get in?
Well, I think Michael just kind of said what I was going to say, and that, you know, what precedes this should be a healthy level of discussion with the appropriate people that informs the rating. You know, in my prior organization, we went down this rabbit hole. It's like talking about performance rating. You know, what's the difference between a 4-point and a 5-point? Um, what I think there are good and how I would approach this is to not try to interpret 12 versus 10, but what's at the top and in the middle at the bottom. And the healthier, you know, so treat it like a ranking system and not let the conversation get wrapped up. Because at my prior organization, we went down this rabbit hole and we ultimately went to kind of red, yellow, green kind of to avoid that conversation of you know, parsing a 10 versus an 8, because that's kind of error. But you know, 10 versus 2 is a real difference in what you need to worry about.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that one. Any other comments on this? As I'm going to drive us to a close as we reach the top of the hour. The bottom line, you know, we talked about ERM as a capability. It's about identifying events that can be favorable or unfavorable that affect the organization operations. And, you know, one of the themes, and Michael just hit on it again, is that certainly the board and the executive leadership need to be aligned on the organization's risk appetite, what the risks are, you know, risk appetite and risk tolerance. We didn't do a deep dive on those things. We could have a session just on risk appetite and risk tolerance by itself. But beyond that too, this all has to filter down. It has to be embedded into the organizational culture. Because in the end, ERM is providing reasonable assurance. I love the ambiguity of the phrase, reasonable assurance, that in consideration of the risks and our risk appetite and our risk tolerance, that the organization will be able to achieve its strategic and operational objectives, and that hopefully that gets done without interruption, or certainly with minimal interruption. But we know it's not going to be linear anyway. So this is, you know, back to that point where you need to make sure the program is scaled appropriately for your organization so that it adds value to what you do, and it's not just a box checking exercise. It has to have meaning. It has to support the board and its fiduciary responsibility. It has to, you know, it can be an engaging, it can be engaging for the whole organization to be involved, and it can be effectively infused into your culture. I wouldn't, you know, I'm not saying we need to say we have a risk culture, but it can be, the principles of this can be infused so that when staff is looking at a new program, that the principles behind thinking through the risks and opportunities that present themselves in that are taken into consideration, or that when when the organization is considering adding something to its portfolio, can we really add this? You know, do we really want to add this? Do we need to drop something else? So again, this just fuels that decision making. So that was it for today. You know, anyone, I would encourage, we've got 3 minutes here. Anyone who either wants to share a takeaway or aha moment you might have had today, or thoughts on what you might be doing next in your organization, or sharing feedback on the terrible job the facilitator did, or what we could have done better to make this a better experience. A couple minutes of open forum if you want it. Okay, it looks
I
like,
mean, I could just give one comment. I mean, I personally like the idea of making a more formal exercise of trying to sort through this rather than more informally asking people to sort of brainstorm and let's find out what is our biggest problem and go forward. I think having a more well thought out and less spur of the moment decision making about what are the biggest issues that have to be faced seems like a very wise thing to do. And I think, at least for me, I think that your presentation and stuff did sort of outline, maybe not giving us all of the details about how to do it, but sort of outlined, you know, how you can start trying to make that transformation into a more well thought out process of determining where the biggest concerns are in your association. So I think that was very good.
great. Thanks for sharing that, Jim. I appreciate it. Anything else?
I just want to add one thing which Jim reminded me of. I think we had a real challenge in some of our earlier conversations with the board around successfully framing, identifying risks for the organization to to a more narrow set that really impact the organization. We ended up going down rabbit holes of, well, the whole geopolitical state of the globe is really, I mean, yes, important, but trying to always bring it back to the impact on the organization can be challenging, particularly with a board of volunteers. And so that has to be actively managed, I think, in the conversation, is being really intentional about trying to bring it back, about asking the question, well, how does that impact us in a really substantive way that would mean that we put it on the register and such. And that can be a challenge that you can only sort of work through intentional conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Michael.
Matt, I think one, I'll be real quick, but one thing you said several times, but didn't make a big deal, but I think is incredibly important, is just pointing out that somebody needs to be in charge of this. Somebody needs to wake up thinking about this. It needs to be part of their job to make sure that it stays on everyone's place, you know, on everyone's plate at the appropriate time is really important.
Yeah, 100%. Otherwise, it doesn't get done for
Right.
sure. So at this point, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone for your participation. I hope you found this worthwhile investment of your time. And if you need any additional information, I put both my name up here, but also Gigi Schwartz, CFAO for AIP, is the hub of AIP's ERM effort. And so you can also reach out to her. And again, thanks for participating. I hope everyone has a great holiday and best wishes for 2025.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
We'll be sharing the recording after the meeting as well. Thank you for joining.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.